He is used to being the strongest man in any room. She is used to never backing down, not even an inch. The problem? Now they have to face each other every single day, trapped between exercises, arguments, and a routine where neither one wants to give in. What begins as a clash of wills quickly turns into something far more dangerous and much harder to ignore. The sound came before the pain, a wet, sharp crack, like a branch snapping under too much weight. Henry Parker felt it travel up from his left knee through his entire spine, and for a fraction of a second, the world went completely silent. The roar of 40,000 people vanished. The floodlights above Ashworth Stadium blurred into a single white sheet. His body understood what had happened before his mind did. He hit the grass on his side, and the turf was cold and damp against his cheek. The smell of earth and cut grass filled his nose, a smell he had loved since he was 6 years old, kicking a ball in his grandmother's backyard in Leeds. Now it made his stomach turn. His left leg wouldn't answer. He pressed both palms flat against the ground and tried to push himself up. His arms were strong enough. His right leg responded. But the left knee buckled the moment he put weight on it, and a bolt of pain shot through him so fast he had to clench his jaw shut to keep from making a sound. He would not scream. Not here. Not with cameras pointed at him from every angle. The stadium had gone quiet in that strange collective way that only happens when something truly wrong unfolds in front of a crowd. No chanting, no whistles. Just the low hum of thousands of people holding their breath. Henry stared at the grass. He could feel the medical team running toward him. The vibration of their footsteps reached him through the ground before he heard their voices. Someone called his name. Someone else was already on a radio. He didn't look up. He couldn't. Because looking up meant seeing the faces in the stands, the pity, the worry, the slow realization settling over everyone that the semi-final was over for him. Pity was the one thing Henry Parker could not stomach. 2 medics knelt beside him. One stabilized his knee with practiced hands. The other asked him questions he answered through his teeth. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. Can you feel this? Yes. Does this hurt? What do you think? Can you stand with support? He didn't want support. But his body had stopped taking orders, so he let them pull him up, one arm over each shoulder, and he kept his eyes fixed on the tunnel ahead. 30 meters. He counted each step. The crowd began to clap. That slow, respectful applause that meant goodbye. He hated it. In the tunnel, the fluorescent lights were harsh after the floodlit pitch, and the concrete walls smelled like disinfectant and old sweat. They lowered him onto a stretcher, though he insisted he could sit. The head physio, a grey-haired man named Collins who had worked with the club for 20 years, was already examining the knee with a grim expression that told Henry everything he needed to know. "We'll need imaging," Collins said, "but I want to be honest with you." "Then be honest." Collins paused, his fingers pressed gently around the swollen joint. "This isn't a 2-week rest, Henry. This is months, possibly the better part of a year." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Henry stared at the ceiling. A crack ran along the concrete above him, thin and jagged, and he followed it with his eyes because it was easier than looking at anyone in the room. Months. A year. The word echoed inside his skull, bouncing off walls he didn't know were there. He was 32. In football, 32 was not old, but 32 with a destroyed knee. That was a different arithmetic entirely. He had seen it happen to others. The surgery, the rehabilitation, the optimistic press releases, and then the slow, quiet fade into retirement. A commentator gig, a coaching badge, a life built around the memory of what the body used to do. The stretcher beneath him was thin and hard, and the paper cover crinkled every time he shifted. He could hear the muffled roar of the stadium above, the match continuing without him, as if the game itself hadn't noticed he was gone. His phone buzzed somewhere. Then again. Then a steady stream of vibrations that meant the news was already spreading. His agent, his mother, teammates, reporters, everyone would want to know the same thing. Will he play again? Henry closed his eyes and pressed his thumb and index finger against the bridge of his nose. His fingers smelled like grass and adhesive tape, Collins was still talking. Specialist consultation. MRI tomorrow. Surgical options. Recovery protocols. Henry heard none of it. He was thinking about the moment just before the fall, the sprint, the cut to the left, the way his body had moved without thought, perfectly synchronized, every muscle firing in the exact right order. He had felt invincible. For one brief second, he had been exactly what he was built to be. And then the sound came. And now he was here, lying on a stretcher in a concrete tunnel, staring at a crack in the ceiling, while the world moved on above him. His right hand found the edge of the stretcher and gripped it until his knuckles went white. He cracked his knuckles one by one, a sharp, dry sound that made Collins glance over with a frown. Henry didn't notice. He was already building the wall, brick by brick, the way he always did when something threatened to break through. The fear, the grief, the rage, all of it pushed behind a door and locked. By the time the ambulance arrived, his face was stone. His voice was steady. His eyes were dry, but his hand hidden at his side was still gripping the edge of the stretcher so hard that the metal frame bent slightly under his fingers. No one noticed. 3 weeks after the surgery, Henry Parker's mansion in Hampstead still smelled like a hospital. Antiseptic wipes, sterile bandages, the sharp tang of medical-grade ice packs that someone on his staff replaced every 4 hours, whether he asked for them or not. The East Wing sitting room had been converted into a rehabilitation space. The furniture was pushed against the walls and covered in white sheets, like ghosts of the life he used to live. In their place stood a padded treatment table, resistance bands in 5 different colors, a set of ankle weights and a balance board that Henry refused to look at because it reminded him of a toy. He sat in a leather armchair near the window, his left leg elevated on a cushioned stool, and stared at the garden outside. The roses were blooming. He didn't care about the roses. He was counting the minutes until the new physiotherapist arrived, the specialist the club's medical team had assigned to his recovery. He'd been told she was the best. He'd also been told she was young. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. His assistant, Malcolm, a wiry man in his late 50s with silver hair cropped close and a face that had seen everything twice, answered the door and led her through the hallway. Henry heard her before he saw her. Light footsteps, the rattle of equipment in a heavy bag. And then she appeared in the doorway of his makeshift rehabilitation room, and his first thought was that someone had made a mistake. She was small, not short exactly, but compact, the kind of frame that disappeared in a crowd. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot that looked like it had been done in a car mirror. She wore a white clinical coat with the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and the bag on her shoulder was so stuffed with equipment that it pulled her slightly to one side. There was a pen tucked behind her left ear that she seemed to have forgotten about. Henry looked her over from the armchair. He didn't stand. "You're the specialist." She set the bag down on the treatment table with a solid thud. "Zoe Wright. The club sent my credentials ahead." "I was expecting someone more." He let the word hang. She didn't fill the silence for him. Just began unpacking her bag, a portable ultrasound unit, electrode pads, a set of measuring tools he didn't recognize. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times, every item placed in a specific spot on the table. "More what?" she finally asked without looking up. "Experienced." She paused. Her fingers rested on a resistance band. Then she turned to face him, and he noticed her eyes for the first time. Light brown, steady, completely unimpressed. "I've been working with high-level athletes for 6 years. I've rehabilitated 2 Premier League players, an Olympic sprinter, and a rugby forward who tore both his ACL and MCL in the same match." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm the person who's going to determine whether you compete again. If you'd prefer someone who looks the part more than I do, go ahead and request a replacement. But it'll cost you time you don't have." The room went still. Malcolm, standing in the doorway, pressed his lips together in a way that might have been a suppressed smile. He excused himself quietly and closed the door behind him. Henry said nothing. He studied her the way he studied opponents before a match, looking for weakness, for hesitation, for the moment someone blinked first. She didn't blink. "Fine," he said. "Let's get started." The first session lasted 11 minutes. Henry approached rehabilitation the way he approached everything, as a fight to be won through sheer force. When she asked him to perform a slow knee extension, he pushed through the full range of motion in half the time she'd prescribed. When she placed her hands on his calf to guide a stretch, he resisted her grip instinctively, his muscles locking, pushing back, turning a gentle exercise into a contest. She corrected him twice. He ignored her. On the third repetition, when he forced his knee past the angle she had marked with tape on the table, she stepped back, removed her hands, and turned off the portable ultrasound unit. "We're done." He looked up, sweat beading along his hairline. "We just started. I'm not going to watch you tear yourself apart because you can't tell the difference between working hard and being reckless." She began packing the ultrasound back into its case. "When you're ready to follow a program instead of fighting one, I'll be in the next room." She picked up her bag and walked out. Henry sat on the treatment table, his left knee throbbing, his jaw so tight it ached. The room smelled like the electrode gel she'd applied and never wiped off. Cool, slightly metallic, unfamiliar. The resistance bands hung from their hooks in neat rows, untouched. He cracked his knuckles, one by one. The sound bounced off the bare walls. No one talked to him like that. Not coaches, not club directors, not the press. He had built a career on being the strongest person in any room. And this woman, this small, quiet woman with a pen behind her ear, had walked out on him 11 minutes into their first session. He stared at the closed door. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't call the club to demand a replacement. He didn't call Malcolm, he didn't call anyone. He sat there for a long time, flexing his fingers, listening to the silence she'd left behind. In the next room, Zoe Wright set her bag on the floor, pulled the pen from behind her ear, and opened his medical file. She read every page again, even though she had already memorized most of it on the drive over. The MRI scans, the surgical notes, the post-operative assessments. Her hands were steady, but her heart was beating fast, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion of holding your ground against someone who is used to the entire world giving way. She uncapped the pen and made her first note in the margin of his file. Patient resistant to protocol, high pain tolerance, 0 patience, will need to earn trust before any real progress. She underlined the last sentence twice. Rain had been falling on Hampstead for 4 straight days, and the windows of the rehabilitation room were streaked with water that distorted the garden outside into a smear of green and grey. Zoe arrived each morning at 9, never a minute late, never a minute early. Henry had started noticing this with the sort of attention he usually reserved for studying opposing teams, involuntary, obsessive, slightly annoyed at himself for caring. She had a routine that never changed. Bag on the table, equipment out in the same order every time. Ultrasound first, then electrodes, then resistance bands, then the measuring tape she used to track swelling. She wiped down the treatment table with the same antiseptic cloth, always starting from the left corner. She checked his chart. She checked the temperature of the room. She adjusted the blinds to the exact same angle. It drove him insane. "Do you ever just walk in and start?" he asked on the 4th morning, watching her align the resistance bands by color for the 3rd time. "No." "Why not?" She slid her glasses down to the tip of her nose. They were thin-framed, slightly too large for her face, and looked at him over the lenses. "Because your knee doesn't care if you're bored." He cracked his knuckles. She flinched, almost invisible, but he caught it, a tiny tightening around her eyes, the briefest pause in her hands. "That sound," she said, returning to her setup, "is going to haunt my nightmares." "Good. Then we're even." The sessions followed the same pattern every day. She gave instructions in a calm, measured voice. He followed them, reluctantly, impatiently, with a running commentary of complaints that she absorbed without reaction. The exercises were slow, painfully slow. Knee extensions held for 10 seconds, gentle rotations with a foam roller under his calf, ice for 20 minutes. Repeat. For a man who had spent his entire life sprinting, this crawl was its own kind of torture. "I could do twice this speed," he said on day 5, holding a quad stretch that made his thigh tremble. "You could, and then you'd be back in surgery by Thursday." "You don't know that." She stopped writing in her chart and looked at him, really looked. Not at his knee, not at his posture, not at the angle of his leg. At him. I know that your MRI shows a graft that needs 12 weeks to integrate. I know that the scar tissue around your joint is still forming. And I know that you've already tried to rush this once and I had to stop the session. She capped her pen. So yes, I do know that. He held the stretch, said nothing. She went back to writing. That was the thing about her that unsettled him most. She never raised her voice, never matched his intensity. She simply stated facts with the same tone someone might use to read a weather forecast, and somehow that calm certainty was harder to argue against than any shouting match he'd ever had on a pitch. By the second week, something shifted. It happened on a Tuesday, though neither of them would have been able to say exactly when it started. He arrived at the rehabilitation room before she did. Only by 2 minutes, but enough to notice that the treatment table was bare, the equipment still packed, the room cold. He turned on the heating himself, found the antiseptic wipes under the sink, and cleaned the table surface. When she walked in and saw it, she paused in the doorway with her bag on her shoulder, and something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe. Or something softer. She didn't comment. But that morning, when he completed a full set of extensions without complaint, she said good, in a voice that was warmer than any he'd heard from her. One word, but he carried it through the rest of the day like a coin in his pocket. He began paying attention to things he hadn't noticed before, the way she studied his scans, holding them up to the window light, her brow furrowed, her lips moving slightly, as if she were having a private conversation with the images. The way she arrived each morning with her coat still damp from the walk to her car, which meant she parked at the far end of the drive instead of pulling up to the door. The way she always warmed her hands before touching his knee, rubbing her palms together quickly. A small gesture that cost her nothing and meant everything when you were the one on the table. She noticed things too. She noticed that he never complained about pain. Not real pain, the deep, grinding kind that made his face go still and his breathing change. He complained about boredom, about slowness, about the taste of the protein shakes his nutritionist left in the fridge. But when the exercises hit a nerve or the swelling pressed against the graft, he went silent. His jaw would set, his eyes would fix on a point across the room, and his right hand would find the edge of the table and grip it until the knuckles whitened. She learned to read that silence the way she read his scans, carefully, thoroughly, without letting him know she was watching. On the last day of the second week, she was packing up when he spoke from the armchair by the window. The rain had finally stopped, and weak afternoon light was pushing through the clouds. Right. She looked up. He almost never used her name. You're not what I expected, she waited. That's not a compliment, he added quickly. I'm just saying you're not what I expected. She zipped her bag shut and pulled the strap over her shoulder. The pen was behind her ear again. She never seemed to notice when it migrated there. Neither are you, she said, and she left before he could ask what she meant. He sat in the armchair for a long time after, watching the last of the rain drip from the roses outside. His knee ached. The room smelled like antiseptic, and the faint trace of something else, something warm like vanilla, that clung to the air near the treatment table where she had been standing. He cracked his knuckles absently. This time the sound didn't make him feel better. The kettle in the rehabilitation room had not been there before. Henry noticed it on a Monday morning, small, white, sitting on the counter near the sink with a box of chamomile tea beside it. He hadn't asked for it. Malcolm hadn't mentioned it. But when Zoe arrived that morning, she walked straight to it, filled it with water, and switched it on without a word, as if it had always been there. He watched her pour 2 cups. She set one on the table beside his armchair. No sugar, no milk. She didn't ask how he took it because she had already noticed, over the past 3 weeks, that he drank everything plain. He picked up the cup and said nothing, but he drank every drop. The weeks had a rhythm now. Morning sessions, afternoon rest, evening stretches that she supervised through video calls from her apartment, her face small on his phone screen, her voice clear and steady in his ear while he worked through the movements alone. He didn't tell her that he kept the phone propped on the windowsill so she couldn't see his face during the exercises that hurt most. She didn't tell him that she could hear the change in his breathing anyway. His progress was real, measurable. She showed him the numbers every Friday: range of motion, swelling reduction, muscle activation, charts and graphs that she laid out on the table with the same care she gave everything. He pretended to study them. What he actually studied was the way she explained them. Hands moving through the air, tracing invisible angles, her voice speeding up when she was excited about a result. She got excited about millimeters, about degrees, about fractions of movement that most people would never notice. He found it strange. Then he found it impressive. Then he found it something else entirely, something he didn't have a name for yet, and he shut that thought down before it had a chance to settle. One evening a session ran late. The sky outside the windows had gone dark without either of them noticing. The room was lit only by the overhead lamp above the treatment table, casting a warm circle of light that made everything outside it feel far away. She was working on his knee manually, slow, deep pressure along the scar tissue, her thumbs moving in careful circles. He was sitting on the edge of the table, his left leg extended, his hands flat on the surface beside him. He could feel the warmth of her fingers through the thin layer of medical cream she used, and each press sent a dull ache through the joint that was strangely grounding, like his body was remembering what it was capable of. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Her hands didn't stop. "You're going to ask whether you want to or not." Almost a smile. He swallowed it. "When I was on that pitch, before the injury." He paused. The room was so quiet he could hear the clock on the wall. "I was having the best match of my season. Everything was working. My body was doing exactly what I told it to do. And then..." He stopped. Her fingers paused. She didn't look up, but her stillness was its own kind of attention. "I keep replaying that moment. The second before the knee went. And I can't figure out what I did wrong, what step I missed, what angle was off." His voice dropped. "And I'm starting to think maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was just time." She looked up then. His eyes were fixed on the dark window across the room, but they weren't seeing the glass or the night behind it. They were somewhere else, on a pitch, under floodlights, in the body that used to obey him. "I'm scared," he said. 2 words, barely audible. His throat moved as if the sentence had cost him something physical. "I'm scared that I'm never going to feel that again, that I'm going to spend the rest of my life remembering what it was like to be the person I used to be, and I won't know who the hell I am without it." The room held its breath. Zoe set down the tube of cream. She wiped her hands slowly on a towel, and then she did something she had never done before. She placed her palm flat on his injured knee, not pressing, not examining, just resting there warm and steady, with a gentleness that had nothing to do with therapy and everything to do with something she hadn't intended to offer. He looked down at her hand, then at her face. She was close, closer than she'd been in weeks of sessions, because the table was narrow and she had leaned in without realizing. He could see the tiny freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose. He'd never noticed them before, hidden as they were behind those glasses she was always pushing up. Her lips were slightly parted, and her eyes, those steady, unshakable eyes, were softer than he had ever seen them. The air in the room changed, thickened, became something he could feel against his skin. He leaned toward her, slowly. Not a decision, more like gravity, like something pulling him forward without asking permission. His gaze dropped to her mouth for half a second, and he saw her breath catch, saw the faintest tremor in her lower lip. She didn't move back. For 3 heartbeats they stayed like that. Close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. Close enough that one small movement would have closed the distance entirely. Then she turned her head. Just a fraction. Her hand slid off his knee and found the towel again, gripping it. "You should rest," she murmured. "Early session tomorrow." She stepped back, gathered the cream, the towel, the chart she'd been filling in. Her movements were quick now, efficient, stripped of the ritual slowness he'd grown used to. She didn't look at him again. "Good night, Parker." The door closed behind her. Henry sat on the edge of the table in the half-dark room, his heart slamming against his ribs, like it was trying to break free. His knee ached. His hands were gripping the table edge. The spot where her palm had rested still held warmth, fading slowly into the cold. He didn't move for a long time. In the hallway, Zoe Wright leaned against the wall and pressed her hands to her face. Her fingers were trembling. Her pulse was racing in a way that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with a line she had almost crossed. Almost. She picked up her bag from the floor, pulled her coat on, and walked to the front door. Malcolm was in the kitchen, reading a newspaper. He glanced up as she passed. "Everything all right, Miss Wright?" "Fine," she said. "Everything's fine." Malcolm watched her leave. Then he folded the newspaper, looked toward the hallway that led to the rehabilitation room, and shook his head slowly. He had worked with Henry Parker for 11 years. He knew every version of the man, the furious competitor, the stubborn patient, the guarded loner who kept the world at a safe distance. But he had never seen Henry look at anyone the way he'd been looking at that woman when Malcolm had brought tea to the door 20 minutes ago and quietly turned around without knocking. Not once. In 11 years. At 3 in the morning, the gymnasium at the back of Henry Parker's estate was a cathedral of shadows. He had found the key in Malcolm's office drawer, a brass thing, old-fashioned, hidden beneath a stack of receipts. The gym had been locked since the surgery. His team had made sure of it. No weights, no treadmill, no temptation. But Henry had been picking locks his entire life, in one way or another. The overhead lights flickered on with a low hum. The equipment gleamed under the fluorescent glow, machines he hadn't touched in weeks, cables and pulleys that used to be extensions of his own body. The rubber floor was cold under his bare feet. The air tasted stale, like a room holding its breath. He started with the stationary bike, low resistance, easy speed. His left knee protested immediately, a deep, grinding ache that radiated up his thigh. But it was manageable, familiar even. Pain was something he understood. Pain was a language he'd been fluent in since he was 17 and broke 2 ribs in a championship match and played the remaining 30 minutes anyway. After the bike, he moved to leg presses, lightweight, controlled movement. Controlled became less controlled after the first set. He added weight, then more. The knee swelled under the pressure, hot and tight against the compression sleeve. But he told himself it was normal, told himself the body needed to be pushed. That Zoe's careful, measured approach was safe, yes, but safe was slow, and slow was a luxury he couldn't afford. He thought about the semi-final, about the sound, about the weeks spent in that rehabilitation room doing exercises that a child could perform, about the numbers on the charts she showed him every Friday, numbers that climbed in fractions when he needed them to leap. He pressed harder. On the 4th set, his knee buckled. Not the same catastrophic failure as the pitch. Nothing tore, nothing snapped. But the joint gave out under the load. His leg collapsed sideways on the press, and he had to grab the machine frame to keep from sliding off the seat entirely. The pain was immediate and sharp, a white flash behind his eyes that made him gasp through clenched teeth. He sat in the dark gym, breathing hard, his left leg throbbing with a familiar, sickening heat. The swelling had already started. He could feel it, the knee filling, tightening, undoing weeks of careful progress in the span of 20 minutes. He limped back to his room, iced the knee with a pack from the kitchen, and lay in bed watching the ceiling until dawn. When Zoe arrived at 9, she knew. Not because he told her, not because Malcolm said anything. She knew the moment she placed her hands on his knee and felt the swelling. Dense, warm, wrong. She didn't speak for a long time. She examined the joint with the same methodical care she always brought, but her movements were slower, heavier. Like each touch was confirming something she had dreaded. "How long were you in the gym?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. Henry. His first name. She'd never used it before, the sound of it in her voice. Tired, disappointed, stripped of every professional barrier, hit him harder than the pain in his knee. "An hour," he said. "Maybe less." She removed her hands from his leg, sat back on the stool, took off her glasses and pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose, a gesture he'd seen her make only once before, on the day his numbers had plateaued and she'd spent an extra hour after the session recalculating his entire recovery timeline. "You've set yourself back at least 3 weeks, possibly more. I won't know until I see new imaging. I can handle—" "You can't." Her voice was flat, not angry. Worse than angry. Resigned. You can't handle it because you don't know what you're handling. You're not fighting an opponent, Henry. You're fighting your own tissue, your own biology, and every time you force it, it pushes back harder. She stood up, began packing her equipment with the same precise movements as always. Ultrasound first, electrodes, bands, measuring tape. But there was a finality to the way she zipped the bag that made his stomach drop. I'm going to recommend the club assign a different therapist. The words landed in the room like a door slamming shut. What? I can't help someone who works against me. She pulled the bag onto her shoulder. The weight of it tilted her frame, and he noticed for the first time how small she looked under it. Every hour I've spent here, and every plan, every adjustment, every session, you undid in one night because you decided you knew better. She looked at him then, directly. And what he saw in her face wasn't anger or frustration. It was hurt. Not the professional disappointment of a therapist losing a case. Something deeper, something personal, as if his recklessness had betrayed not just the recovery plan, but something she had invested that went beyond the clinical. She turned toward the door. He reached out and caught her arm, not hard. His fingers barely closed around her wrist. But the contact stopped them both. Froze the room, froze the air, froze everything except the warmth of her skin under his hand and the sound of his own breathing, ragged and uneven. Don't go. His voice cracked on the second word. He heard it and hated it and couldn't take it back. His grip on her wrist was loose enough that she could have pulled away without effort. She didn't. I don't know how to do this, he said. The words came out rough, unpolished, like stones pulled from somewhere deep and thrown onto the floor between them. I don't know how to be patient. I don't know how to wait. I've never had to trust someone else to tell me what my body can do. I've always just known. And now I don't know anything, and it's... He stopped, swallowed. His thumb pressed against the inside of her wrist, right over her pulse. He could feel it beating, fast. Please stay. She stood very still. Her bag hung heavy on her shoulder. Her eyes were bright and she blinked once, a long, slow blink that she used the way other people use deep breaths. If I stay, she said, and her voice was quiet now, almost gentle. The way you talk to someone standing on a ledge, you do exactly what I say. No exceptions, no negotiations, no midnight sessions. If you go behind my back again, I'm gone, and I won't come back. Okay. I need you to mean it. He looked up at her. His hand was still on her wrist. His eyes, dark, tired, stripped of every defense he usually wore, held hers without flinching. I mean it. She searched his face for something. Whatever she found, it was enough. She exhaled slowly, and the tension in her shoulders released a fraction. Tomorrow, 9 o'clock. We start over. She pulled her wrist free gently. His fingers opened and let her go. She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame, and looked back. And ice that knee. 20 minutes on, 20 off, all night. The door closed. Henry sat alone in the rehabilitation room, surrounded by equipment that he had tried to outrun, and a silence that felt heavier than it had before she arrived. His knee throbbed with the steady, relentless rhythm of a mistake that couldn't be undone. But somewhere beneath the pain, beneath the shame, beneath the anger at himself, there was something new. Small and unfamiliar, lodged in his chest like a splinter. Relief. She was coming back. Something was different about the way he held his body on the treatment table. Zoe noticed it the moment the new phase began. Before the setback, Henry had approached every session like a siege, muscles braced, jaw locked, every fiber ready to fight. Now, when she placed her hands on his knee, she felt something she hadn't felt before. Surrender, not defeat, not resignation, something quieter. The kind of letting go that happens when someone finally stops pretending they don't need help. His muscles softened under her touch, his breathing slowed. When she asked him to hold a stretch for 10 seconds, he held it for 10, not 8, not 15. 10. She didn't comment on it, but something inside her chest loosened too, like a knot she hadn't realized was there. The days settled into a new rhythm. Mornings were for manual therapy and controlled exercises. Afternoons she left a printed sheet of movements he could do alone, gentle ones within safe limits, and he followed them precisely. She knew because she checked, measured the swelling every evening, compared the numbers. They matched. He was listening. On a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks into the restart, she was adjusting the angle of his leg on the table when he spoke without warning. "You always warm your hands before you touch me." She paused. "What?" "Your hands. You rub them together before every session, every single time." She looked at her own palms as if seeing them for the first time. Cold hands on an injured joint can cause muscle guarding. It's standard practice. "Is it?" "Yes." He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. "Okay." She went back to the adjustment, but her fingers felt clumsy for the first time in weeks. She could feel his eyes on the side of her face, not watching the exercise, not tracking the movement, watching her. The same focused intensity he brought to everything, except now it was directed at her, and it made the air in the room feel thin. She finished the set and stepped away to make notes, kept her back to him until her pulse steadied. This was the part that scared her, not his temper, not his stubbornness, not even the way he'd grabbed her wrist that day and asked her to stay with a voice that had unraveled in front of her. She could handle all of that. She'd been handling difficult athletes for years. What scared her was how much she had wanted to stay. The memory rose before she could stop it. A different man, a different training facility 3 years ago. Nathan, sports management, charming in that specific way that men in the industry could be charming. Confident without effort, present without depth. She had fallen for him the way you fall asleep, slowly, then all at once. And when it ended, when she discovered that for him she had been a convenient footnote in a busy calendar, the damage wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. A slow erosion of trust that left her standing on ground she could no longer be sure of. She had rebuilt herself methodically, the way she approached everything. New rules, clear boundaries. Work stays work. Personal stays personal. The two never overlap. Henry Parker was overlap. He was a patient, a case, a knee that needed fixing. And every time she caught herself noticing something that had nothing to do with his recovery, the way his voice dropped when he was being honest, the way he cracked his knuckles less now, as if some restless thing inside him was beginning to quiet, she pulled back, built the wall a little higher. She could not afford to be wrong again, so she kept her distance. Professional, precise, warm hands, steady voice, clinical notes. And if her heart did something inconvenient when he smiled at her, rare and fleeting, like sunlight through English clouds, she filed it away and moved on. Henry felt the shift. He couldn't name it, couldn't point to a specific moment, but somewhere in the past week she had moved further from him. Not physically, she still stood close during sessions, still placed her hands with that careful warmth he had come to rely on, but something behind her eyes had closed. A door he hadn't even known was open had quietly shut, and he was left standing on the wrong side of it, unsure what he'd done. He didn't ask. Asking meant acknowledging that her distance bothered him, and acknowledging that meant admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. Instead, he focused on the work, followed her program, did the exercises, showed up every morning ready to be guided by someone smaller and quieter than anyone who had ever had that kind of power over him. And then Marcus Cole gave the interview. Henry was alone in the sitting room when it aired, an evening sports segment, the kind he usually ignored. But Malcolm had left the television on, and the voice that came through the speakers was one Henry knew well enough to feel in his spine. Marcus Cole, same club division, same position. 5 years younger, 2 inches taller, and gifted with the particular arrogance of a man who had never been seriously injured. He sat across from the interviewer with a posture that was designed to look casual and wasn't. "Look, everyone respects what Henry's done for the sport," Marcus said, leaning back, "but there comes a point where you have to be realistic. A knee injury like that at 32, the numbers don't lie. Maybe it's time to think about what comes next." The interviewer pressed. "Are you saying he should retire?" Marcus smiled, the practiced smile of someone who knew exactly how to plant a seed and make it look like sympathy. "I'm saying the game moves on, with or without anyone." Henry picked up the remote and turned off the television. The screen went black. The room went quiet. He sat in the dark for a long time. He could feel the words burrowing into him, finding the cracks he thought he'd sealed. The game moves on. At 32, the numbers don't lie. Each phrase latched onto a fear he already carried and gave it a voice. A public voice, broadcast into living rooms and locker rooms and front offices where decisions about careers were made over coffee. His right hand found the arm of the chair. He cracked his knuckles. Once, twice, again and again, until the sound filled the empty room like a clock ticking down. When Zoe arrived the next morning, he was already on the treatment table, eyes fixed on the ceiling, jaw set. "Morning," she said, setting her bag down. Silence. She glanced at him. Something in the quality of his stillness, a rigidity that she recognized, the way a sailor recognizes the change in wind that comes before a storm, made her slow down. "Did something happen? Let's just work." His voice was flat. The warmth that had been building over the past 2 weeks, the tentative openness, the small moments of trust, had vanished. In its place was the Henry from the first day. The wall rebuilt, every brick in place, mortared with something cold. She opened her bag and began her routine. Ultrasound first, but her hands, when she rubbed them together, moved a little slower than usual, and the worry that settled behind her ribs had nothing to do with his knee. The rain came back to Hampstead like it had never left. For 3 days after the interview aired, Henry Parker moved through his sessions like a machine running on fumes. He showed up on time. He did the exercises. He followed the program to the letter, but every word out of his mouth was clipped, every response stripped to its minimum, and the silence between his sentences had a weight that pressed against the walls of the rehabilitation room like water behind a dam. Zoe worked through it. She adjusted his exercises. She monitored the swelling. She kept her voice steady and her notes precise and told herself that difficult days were part of the process, that athletes under pressure cycled through moods the way weather cycled through seasons, and the professional thing to do was hold the course. But by the 4th day, the weather inside the room was worse than the weather outside. She was guiding him through a seated leg curl, slow, controlled, the kind of exercise that required patience and trust. When he jerked his leg forward mid-repetition, forcing the motion past the angle she had set. "Stop," she said. "Reset." He did it again. Harder. "Henry, stop. The resistance is too low." His voice was flat, mechanical. "I can handle more. The resistance is exactly where it needs to be based on your last imaging." "Based on your opinion." She set down her chart. "Based on the scans, the measurements, the swelling index, and 6 years of experience. But sure, my opinion." He cracked his knuckles. The sound was sharper than usual, almost aggressive, filling the room with a staccato rhythm that made her jaw tighten. He had been doing it constantly this week, during exercises, between sets, while waiting for the ultrasound to warm up. The sound followed her home at night, echoing in her apartment while she tried to sleep. "Maybe the scans are wrong," he said. "The scans aren't wrong. Maybe the approach is wrong then." She looked at him. He was staring at the wall, not at her, and the angle of his jaw was so sharp it could have cut glass. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. The stubble on his face was 3 days past deliberate. Something had broken inside him since that interview, some internal scaffolding that had been holding the fear at bay. And what was leaking through the cracks wasn't sadness. It was venom. "Cole's right, isn't he?" Henry said quietly. "The numbers don't lie, 32, a knee held together with surgical tape and good intentions. Every week in this room is another week the world forgets I exist." "That's not—" "Do you know what happens to players who disappear during recovery? They become trivia questions. They become remember when. They become the cautionary story someone tells a rookie in a locker room." He turned his head to look at her, and his eyes were hard, glassy. "And here I am, doing leg curls with a foam roller, while the man who wants my spot tells the country I should quit." Zoe didn't flinch. She had learned not to. But each word landed somewhere soft inside her, in the part she had been trying to protect, the part that cared about him in a way she could no longer pretend was purely professional. "You're not disappearing," she said. "You don't know that. I know what your body is doing. I know what the progress looks like. And I know that the man on television is terrified of you coming back, or he wouldn't bother giving interviews about it." Henry laughed, short, bitter, hollow. "Is that your professional assessment?" "It's common sense." He swung his legs off the table and stood, too fast, putting weight on the left knee before it was ready. She saw the wince he tried to hide, the way his hand shot to his thigh. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You haven't been fine all week. And taking it out on me isn't going to change what Marcus Cole said." He turned to face her. And for the first time in days, something flickered behind the armor. A flash of something raw and uncontrolled that he swallowed before it could surface. "I'm not taking anything out on you. You snapped at me 3 times yesterday. You've questioned my program every session this week. And right now you're standing on a knee that isn't ready because you'd rather hurt yourself than admit that someone else's words got to you." She held his gaze. Her voice was firm, but her eyes were glistening. Not quite tears, not quite anything she would allow to fall. "I'm not your opponent, Henry. And I'm not your punching bag." The room went very still. Outside, the rain hammered against the windows. The sound filled the silence between them, relentless, rhythmic, indifferent. "You need to decide what you're fighting for," she said, "because right now you're pushing away every single thing that's trying to help you. And I can take a lot, I've proven that, but I won't stand here and be the person you break yourself against, because the world didn't give you what you wanted fast enough." Her voice caught on the last word. She pressed her lips together, hard, and turned away to pack her bag. Her hands were shaking, barely, just enough that the zipper caught twice before she could close it. She slung the bag over her shoulder and walked to the door without looking back. "Zoe." She stopped. Her hand was on the doorframe, her back to him, and she could feel his eyes on her like heat from a fire she was standing too close to. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said. But she didn't come the next day, or the day after. Malcolm brought the message on the second morning, a short email from the club's medical department explaining that Miss Wright had requested a brief pause in sessions due to scheduling adjustments and that a replacement therapist would be available if needed. Henry read the email on his phone, standing at the window of the rehabilitation room. The equipment was set up the way she always left it. The kettle sat on the counter, cold. The resistance bands hung in their neat row. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else, vanilla, warm and fading. He put the phone down. He didn't request a replacement. Instead, he sat in the armchair by the window and stared at the garden, where the roses were drowning in rain, their petals heavy and bent, clinging to stems that could barely hold them. His right hand rested on the arm of the chair, and for once, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't crack his knuckles. The restlessness was still there, coiled inside him like a spring wound too tight. But the sound felt wrong now. It reminded him of the room when she was in it, and the room without her was a place he didn't want to fill with anything at all. 3 days passed. The replacement therapist came once, a tall, efficient man named Dr. Ellis, who spoke in bullet points and smelled like hand sanitizer. He was perfectly competent. He was also perfectly forgettable. Henry did the session, followed every instruction, and felt nothing, not the ache of being challenged, not the irritation of being told no, not the strange, complicated warmth of being seen by someone who looked at him and understood what was underneath. Just nothing. On the third night, Malcolm knocked on the door of Henry's bedroom. It was late, past 11, and Henry was sitting on the edge of the bed, icing his knee in the dark, the television off, the phone face down on the nightstand. "Can't sleep?" Malcolm asked, leaning against the doorframe. "What do you want, Mal?" The older man crossed his arms. He had a way of standing that made you feel like he could wait forever, like time was something he had more of than anyone else, and was in no hurry to spend. "In all the years I've worked with you," Malcolm said, "I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at her." Henry's hand stopped mid-reach for the ice pack. "I've seen you with trainers, coaches, teammates. I've seen you shake hands with people you respected and ignore people you didn't. But that woman, when she walks into a room, you track her like she's the only moving thing in it." Malcolm paused. "And I've never once seen you crack your knuckles less than when she's smiling." Henry said nothing. "I'm not telling you what to do," Malcolm said. "I never have, but I am telling you what I see. And what I see is a man who just spent 3 days staring at a door, waiting for someone to walk through it. He straightened, tapped the door frame twice with his knuckle, and left. Henry sat in the dark for a long time after that. The ice pack melted against his knee, the cold water seeping through the towel onto the sheets. He didn't move it. Malcolm's words weren't complicated, they weren't philosophical, they were just true. The kind of plain, obvious truth that only lands when someone says it out loud. He picked up his phone, stared at the screen, put it down again, then picked it up once more and typed 3 words to a number he had never used for anything outside of scheduling. "Can we talk?" He sent it before he could change his mind. She never answered the text, not that night, not the next morning. And by the time the sun came through the windows of his bedroom, Henry had checked his phone 11 times, a number he knew because he counted, and hated himself for counting. The email from the club arrived at noon. Formal language, professional tone. Miss Wright had formally requested reassignment from his private rehabilitation case, citing scheduling conflicts and workload adjustments. She would continue her duties at the Ashworth Training Centre, working with other athletes in the program. A new physiotherapist, Dr. Ellis, would assume Henry's recovery full-time. Henry read the email twice. Then he set the phone face down on the table and sat in the rehabilitation room that still smelled like her antiseptic wipes, staring at the neatly arranged resistance bands that no one had touched since the last time her hands had hung them. Scheduling conflicts. He almost laughed. The sessions with Dr. Ellis were clinically flawless. The man followed the same recovery protocol Zoe had designed. She had left detailed notes, meticulous as always, with instructions for every phase. The exercises were identical. The measurements tracked the same data points. The progress continued, steady and measurable. But the room felt like a waiting room now. Somewhere you sat until the thing you actually needed became available again. Henry threw himself into the work with a discipline that surprised even Malcolm. He woke early, did his morning stretches, completed every session without complaint, and spent the afternoons in the pool doing low-impact exercises that Dr. Ellis prescribed. He was, by every measurable standard, the perfect patient, and he was miserable. He missed the sound of her bag hitting the treatment table, the click of her pen, the way she slid her glasses down her nose and said no, like it was a complete sentence. He missed the kettle, he missed the vanilla. He missed being irritated by someone whose irritation made him better. He missed her. The realization hit him not as a revelation, but as an accumulation, like sand filling a glass grain by grain, until one morning he woke up and the glass was full and there was nowhere left to pretend it wasn't. It was Malcolm, of course, who delivered the next blow. He came into the kitchen on a Wednesday evening while Henry was standing at the counter, eating cold pasta from a container with a fork, staring at nothing. Malcolm poured himself a cup of tea, stirred it 3 times, always 3, and leaned against the counter. "Saw something interesting at the training center today," he said, the way he said everything, like he was commenting on the weather rather than dropping a grenade. Henry didn't look up. "I don't care about the training center. Nathan Hale's back." The fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "Who?" "Nathan Hale. Sports management. Used to work with the club's commercial partnerships. Tall fellow, always smiling." Malcolm sipped his tea. "He and Miss Wright were together a few years back, before your time." Henry set the fork down, slowly. The pasta container sat between his hands on the counter, and he stared at it as if it had personally offended him. "How do you know that?" "I know most things that happen in and around this club. It's what you pay me for." Another sip. "He's been around the training center all week. Something about a new sponsorship deal. Very friendly with everyone, especially with her." Henry's jaw tightened. He could feel something building in his chest, hot, unfamiliar, with a sharp edge that he didn't recognize. It wasn't anger, not exactly. Anger was something he knew how to use, something he channeled on the pitch, something that had a purpose and a direction. This was different. This was the feeling of standing outside a window, watching something happening inside that you couldn't reach. "He's her ex," Henry said. Not a question. "Was her ex? From what I understand, it didn't end well." Malcolm set his cup down. "But he's persistent. And she's been spending a lot of time at the center since she left your case." Henry picked up the fork again, put it down, picked it up. "Why are you telling me this?" Malcolm looked at him with the patient, steady gaze of a man who had watched Henry Parker grow from a 21-year-old rookie into whatever he was now. "Because you asked me a long time ago to always tell you the truth, even when you didn't want to hear it. And the truth right now is that a woman you care about is being circled by a man who already hurt her once, and you're standing in your kitchen eating cold pasta and pretending you don't care." He rinsed his cup, placed it in the rack, and left the kitchen without another word. Henry stood at the counter for a long time. The cold pasta grew colder. The kitchen light hummed overhead. Outside, the evening traffic on the Hampstead Road was a distant, indifferent murmur. He thought about Zoe, not the way he usually thought about her, in fragments, in the controlled context of the rehabilitation room, measured and contained. He thought about her the way a dam thinks about the river it's holding back, which is to say he stopped thinking and just felt. The way her hand had rested on his knee that night. The way she had looked at him in the doorway when she threatened to leave, with hurt in her eyes that had nothing to do with professionalism. The way her voice had caught when she told him she wasn't his punching bag, and the way that catch had broken something inside him that hadn't healed since. And now there was a man at the training center, a man who already knew her, who already had a history with her, who was, according to Malcolm, charming and persistent, and very much present in the spaces where Henry was no longer allowed. Jealousy. The word surfaced like a bubble from deep water, and he stared at it in his mind with the baffled recognition of someone encountering a feeling for the very first time. He had never been jealous, not once, not of other players, not of titles he didn't win, not of anything. He had always believed that what was his was earned, and what wasn't earned wasn't worth wanting. But this was different. Because Zoe Wright was not a title. She was not a trophy or a ranking or a contract. She was a woman who had walked into his life with a heavy bag and a pen behind her ear and dismantled every wall he had ever built. And the thought of someone else standing where he should be standing, someone who had already proven they didn't deserve to be there, made his blood burn in a way that no match, no rival, no competition ever had. He gripped the edge of the counter. His knuckles went white. For the first time in his career, Henry Parker was afraid of losing something he had never had the courage to claim. He didn't sleep that night. At 6 in the morning, he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at the face that stared back, hollow-eyed, unshaved, older than it had looked a year ago. He pressed his palms flat against the cold porcelain of the sink and leaned forward until his forehead nearly touched the glass. He couldn't lose her. The thought was so clear, so absolute, that it felt less like a decision and more like a fact of gravity, like something that had always been true and was only now being spoken aloud in the empty bathroom of a man who had never needed anyone and now needed someone so badly it terrified him. He got dressed, slowly, carefully, like a man preparing for the most important match of his life, and then he drove to the training center. The training center smelled like floor wax and effort. Henry walked through the main corridor with his hands in his jacket pockets and his pulse drumming so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. Staff members glanced at him as he passed, surprised, curious, a few openly staring. He hadn't been here in weeks. His presence was a headline waiting to happen. He didn't care. He found her office at the end of the east wing. The door was open. She was inside, standing behind a small desk covered in patient files, sorting them into color-coded stacks with the same meticulous precision she brought to everything. Her hair was down. He had never seen it down before, and the sight stopped him mid-step. It fell past her shoulders in loose waves, darker than he'd imagined, catching the fluorescent light in a way that made it look almost bronze. She hadn't noticed him yet. He leaned against the doorframe and watched her for a moment. She moved a file from one stack to another, paused, moved it back, chewed the corner of her lip, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with her ring finger, a small, unconscious gesture that made his chest ache for reasons he couldn't explain. Then she looked up. She froze. Her hands stopped mid-sort, hovering over the files. Her eyes went wide, then guarded, then something in between that he couldn't read. He looked terrible. He knew it. Dark circles carved deep under his eyes, 3 days of stubble, hair that hadn't seen a comb since yesterday. His jacket was wrinkled. His shoes were untied. He looked like a man who had driven across London at 6 in the morning without a plan, because that was exactly what he was. Henry. His name in her voice. Quiet. Careful. Like she was testing whether it was safe to say. He stepped inside. Slowly. The office was small. Barely room for the desk, 2 chairs and a filing cabinet, and his presence filled it immediately. He stood in the middle of the room, hands still in his pockets, and looked at her. The silence lasted 5 seconds. 10. Long enough for her to notice the way his jaw was working, the way his throat moved, the way he was standing perfectly still in the manner of someone holding themselves together by sheer will. "I've never needed anyone," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges like sandpaper over wood. "My whole life I proved I could do everything alone. Every training session, every title, every injury. I handled it. I didn't ask. I didn't lean. I didn't look sideways for help. And I was proud of that. I wore it like armor." She didn't move. Her fingers rested on the edge of the desk, pressing into the wood. "Then you showed up with that ridiculous bag and your glasses and your pen behind your ear and you made me need someone." His voice cracked. He swallowed hard and pushed through. "And I didn't know what to do with that. It scared me more than the injury, more than the idea of never playing again, because needing someone means they can leave. And I couldn't." He stopped, breathed, started again. "I pushed you away because you got closer than anyone's ever been. Closer than I knew there was a place to get to. And these days without you have been worse than anything. Worse than the knee, worse than the surgery, worse than Cole's interview on every screen in the country. Because for the first time in my life, I missed a person. Not a match, not a pitch, a person." His voice failed on the last word, just gave out, like a rope pulled too tight. Zoe stood behind the desk with her eyes shining. Her lips were pressed together, and her chin trembled once before she steadied it. Her fingers had gone white against the desk edge. He stepped closer, close enough to reach across the narrow space between them. He took her hand, gently, lifting it from the desk, holding it between both of his. Her fingers were cold. He wrapped them in his palms and felt them tremble. "I don't know how to do this," he said, barely above a whisper. "But I want to be with you. Even though I'll get it wrong. Even though I don't have the words for half of what I feel." She didn't answer right away. She looked down at their hands, his, large and rough and scarred from years of sport, wrapped around hers with a tenderness that contradicted everything about the man the world thought he was. Then she looked up and her expression broke open like dawn. "I want that too," she whispered. A smile trembled onto her lips, wide, unguarded, luminous. "I've wanted that for longer than I should admit." He exhaled. The sound came from somewhere so deep it was almost a shudder. Then, slowly, he released her hand and raised both of his to her face. His palms cradled her jaw, thumbs resting against her cheekbones, fingers threaded into her hair. He tilted her face up toward his, and for one suspended moment, they just looked at each other, close enough to share breath, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off each other's skin. He kissed her, carefully, like he was asking permission with every fraction of movement. His lips brushed hers once, soft, tentative, barely there, and she made a small sound in the back of her throat that undid him completely. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and felt her hands come up to grip his wrists, her fingers wrapping tight around the tendons, holding on as if the room had tilted, and he was the only solid thing left. The kiss tasted like coffee and morning air, and something sweet beneath it all that was just her. He pulled her closer, one hand sliding from her jaw to the back of her neck, the other settling at the curve of her waist. She leaned into him, and the space between their bodies disappeared. The files on the desk scattered. Neither of them noticed. He lifted her, effortless, and set her on the edge of the desk, and she wrapped her legs around him, pulling him in, her fingers moving from his wrists to his shoulders to the back of his neck. They broke apart minutes later, gasping. He pressed his forehead to hers, their breathing tangled in the small space between their mouths. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The city glittered through the bedroom window like a scattered handful of amber and white. They didn't rush. That was the thing Zoe would remember later, when she replayed this night in her mind during quiet moments. They didn't rush. After the training center, after the kiss that had rearranged every careful boundary she had spent years building, they had driven to his house in a silence that was full rather than empty. His hand had found hers across the center console and stayed there, his thumb tracing slow circles on her knuckles, and neither of them had said a word because words would have been smaller than what was happening. Now they stood in his bedroom, and London breathed below them through the glass. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the office, like she was the only thing in the room, in the city, in the world that mattered. But here in the low light, with the door closed and the noise of everything else shut out, there was something new in his eyes. Vulnerability. Raw and unmasked. The same man who had stared down stadiums full of people without flinching was standing before her, with his hands slightly unsteady, and the sight of it made her heart crack open in a way she hadn't known it could. She reached up and placed her palm flat against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat. Fast, heavy, almost urgent. The fabric of his shirt was warm from his skin. He covered her hand with his own and held it there, pressing it closer, as if he wanted her to feel exactly what she was doing to him. "I'm nervous," she said. A small laugh escaped her, surprised at her own honesty. He looked down at her. His thumb brushed across her knuckles again, the same gesture from the car, already becoming theirs. "So am I." She smiled. He didn't smile back. Instead, he leaned down and kissed her forehead, just her forehead, a press of lips so gentle it was almost a prayer, and then her temple, and the curve of her cheekbone, and the corner of her mouth, mapping the geography of her face with a patience that contradicted every impatient thing she had ever known about him. When he finally reached her lips, the kiss was different from the one at the training center. Slower, deeper. The kind of kiss that lives in the space between breathing and not breathing, where every second stretches until it feels like it contains an entire conversation. Her fingers found the buttons of his shirt. She unfastened them one at a time, and with each one, she felt his breath change, a slight catch, a deeper draw, a tremor in his chest that he couldn't hide. When her fingertips touched the bare skin of his stomach, he inhaled sharply, and his hands tightened at her waist. He was careful with her, impossibly, deliberately careful. His hands, the same hands that had gripped football pitches and trophy handles and the edges of treatment tables until the metal bent, moved over her skin like she was something he was afraid of breaking. He found the zipper at the back of her top and lowered it slowly, his lips following the path of newly exposed skin along her shoulder, and she shivered, not from cold, but from the feeling of being known by someone's touch. She had forgotten what this felt like, or maybe she had never known, because nothing in her past had prepared her for the way Henry Parker loved, with his whole body, his whole attention, as if the world outside this room had simply stopped existing. He murmured against her collarbone, words she could barely hear, her name, and then something else, something raw and quiet, that made her breath stutter and her fingers grip his shoulders harder. The intensity of his voice matched the slow, deliberate way he moved, and the combination made everything feel like it was happening for the first time, because it was. Not technically, but in every way that mattered. She let herself be vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed in years. The careful walls, the professional distance, the rules she had written for herself after Nathan, all of it dissolved under his hands, his mouth, his whispered words. She let him see her, all of her. And when he looked at her, really looked with those dark eyes that held nothing back, she understood that she was seeing him too. The real him. Stripped of armor, stripped of reputation, stripped of everything except the man underneath. They moved together in the quiet room, with the city lights painting shifting patterns on the sheets, and their breathing the only sound. His forehead pressed against hers at one point, and she opened her eyes to find his already open, watching her, and the look on his face was so completely unguarded that her eyes stung. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets. His arm was around her, heavy and warm, and her head rested in the hollow between his shoulder and his neck. She could feel his pulse against her cheek, slowing now, evening out. Her fingers drew absent patterns on his chest, tracing the edges of old scars she hadn't seen before. A small one near his ribs, another along his collarbone. "You're full of marks," she said softly. He turned his head. His lips brushed her hair. "You should see the other guys." She laughed. A real laugh, quiet but full, the kind that vibrated against his skin. He tightened his arm around her and pressed his mouth to the top of her head, and she felt him smile against her hair. "Stay tonight," he said. "I'm already staying. Stay tomorrow, too." She tilted her face up. His eyes were half closed, drowsy, softer than she had ever seen them. She kissed the underside of his jaw. The rough stubble scratched her lips and settled back against him. "Ask me tomorrow," she whispered. He pulled her closer. Outside, London hummed its low, endless song. The sheets smelled like both of them now. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, the silence in the room wasn't something to be filled. It was enough. The whistle blew at 4:30, and Henry Parker completed his first full training session since the injury. 90 minutes, full drills, sprints, direction changes, ball work, defensive positioning. His knee held, not without protest. He could feel the joint talking to him, a low hum of warning that Zoe had taught him to listen to instead of fight. But it held. Every stride, every cut, every moment his boot hit the grass, and his body did what he asked it to do. He stood at the center of the pitch after the final whistle, hands on his knees, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his jaw onto the turf. His legs were shaking, his lungs burned. And somewhere behind his ribs, something was breaking open. Not from pain, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of being whole again. Months of treatment tables and ice packs and resistance bands, and the slow, grinding patience that Zoe had demanded from him, until he learned to demand it from himself. All of it condensed into this single moment, on this pitch, under a sky that was finally clearing after weeks of grey. He walked off the field on legs that felt like they belonged to him for the first time in half a year. The corridor leading to the locker rooms was dim and cool, and she was there. Standing against the wall, arms crossed, no clipboard, no chart, no pen behind her ear. Just her. She smiled. Not the careful, measured smile she gave during sessions. A real one, wide, bright, trembling at the edges with something she couldn't contain. Her eyes were glossy. He walked straight to her. Didn't slow down. Wrapped his arms around her waist and lifted her off the ground, spinning her once before setting her back on her feet. She laughed, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls, and gripped his shoulders, her fingers digging into the damp fabric of his training shirt. "If you strain that knee on that last tackle," she said, breathless, "I will end you." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Worth it." They stood like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, her hands on his shoulders, his hands at her waist, breathing each other in. The corridor smelled like grass and exertion and the faint trace of vanilla that clung to her skin. They both knew he wasn't talking about the tackle. The happiness lasted 3 days. It started as whispers in the training center corridors. Small comments from staff members who had noticed things, the way Henry looked at her during sessions, the way she arrived at his house each morning, the way they had been seen together outside professional hours. Gossip moved through the club the way it always did, quietly, efficiently, with the destructive precision of water finding cracks. By Thursday, it had reached the medical director. By Friday, it had reached the board. Zoe was called to a meeting at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, the kind of time slot that existed specifically for conversations no one wanted to have. She sat in a conference room across from 3 members of the club's medical oversight committee and the head of athletic operations. The chair was uncomfortable. The coffee they offered was untouched. They were polite, professional. They used phrases like potential conflict of interest and ethical boundaries and the integrity of the rehabilitation process. They never said she had done anything wrong. They didn't have to. The implication filled the room like smoke. She answered every question with the composure she had been building her entire career, explained the timeline, the professional boundaries maintained during treatment, the fact that the personal relationship had begun after she transferred his case to Dr. Hellis. Her voice didn't waver. But when she left the building and sat in her car, her hands shook against the steering wheel. That evening, she told Henry. They were in his kitchen, the remnants of dinner between them, and she laid it out with the same clinical precision she used for everything: the meeting, the questions, the unspoken threat to the reputation she had spent years earning. "Don't get involved," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were tired. "I'll handle this myself." Henry listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He nodded once when she finished and pulled her close, pressing his lips to her temple. But his jaw was set, and behind his eyes, something had already decided. The boardroom door opened without a knock. 6 heads turned at once. The medical director mid-sentence, 2 committee members with pens raised, the head of athletic operations leaning back in his chair, and 2 club executives who had been summoned for what was supposed to be a private, decisive meeting about the future of Zoe Wright's position. Henry Parker walked in like he owned the room, which, given his contract value, wasn't far from the truth. He didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, still in his training gear, and looked at each person in the room the way he looked at defenders before a free kick, measuring them, calculating, finding the gap. "I understand you're discussing Miss Wright's position." The medical director cleared his throat. "Henry, this is an internal review. You weren't—" "I know I wasn't invited. I'm here anyway." Silence. He placed both hands flat on the table and leaned forward. His voice was controlled, deliberate, each word placed with the precision of someone who had rehearsed nothing and meant everything. "Zoe Wright is the most competent professional who has ever worked on my recovery. Every single step of progress I've made, every degree of mobility, every percentage of strength, exists because of her knowledge, her discipline, and her refusal to let me destroy myself when I tried." He paused. Let the words settle. "And yes, I'm in love with her." The room didn't breathe. If anyone in this room thinks that fact erases her competence, then the problem isn't with her ethics, it's with yours. His eyes moved across the table, holding each gaze long enough to make it uncomfortable. She transferred my case before anything personal began. She followed every protocol, she documented everything. And she sat in this room yesterday and defended herself with more professionalism than I've seen from half the people at this table. The medical director opened his mouth. Henry didn't let him speak. If someone needs to leave this club, it should be me, not her. Because she has given this organization 6 years of flawless work, and the only reason we're having this conversation is because she had the misfortune of being excellent at her job in a room where I happened to fall in love with her. He straightened, pulled his hands off the table. "She stays, that's not a request." He walked out without waiting for a response. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a slam. Zoe found out 4 hours later. She was in her apartment, curled on the couch with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, staring at her phone and waiting for the email that would determine whether her career survived the week. When Malcolm's name appeared on the screen, she almost didn't answer. "He did what?" Malcolm's voice carried the warm, slightly rough quality of a man who had been smiling for several hours straight. He told her everything: the entrance, the speech, the silence that followed, and then he said something that made her set the tea down and press her hand to her mouth. "The board withdrew the review an hour ago. The matter is closed." She sat in the quiet of her apartment for a long time after hanging up. The streetlights outside her window painted orange stripes across the ceiling. Her tea had gone cold. Her eyes were wet. When she arrived at his house that evening, he was in the kitchen leaning against the counter, waiting. He looked like a man bracing for impact. She walked up to him and hit his chest with the flat of her hand. Not hard, just enough. "I told you not to get involved. I know. You never listen. You are the most stubborn, impossible—" Her voice broke. She pressed her face into his chest and wrapped her arms around him so tightly that he stumbled back half a step against the counter. He recovered and folded his arms around her, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other pressed flat between her shoulder blades. "You're impossible," she whispered into his shirt. "Learned from the best," he murmured against her hair. She laughed. It came out tangled with tears, messy, relieved, full of everything she had been holding since that conference room. He held her tighter and rested his chin on top of her head, and the kitchen was quiet except for her breathing and the hum of the refrigerator and the steady rhythm of his heart under her ear. He would never tell her how scared he had been, not of the board, not of the consequences, but of the possibility that his words wouldn't be enough, that the world would punish her for something that was the best thing that had ever happened to him. She pulled back and looked up at him with wet eyes and a trembling smile. "Thank you," she said. He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Always." Ashworth Stadium was full. Every seat taken, every voice raised. The floodlights turned the pitch into a bright green stage, and the noise, that deep rolling thunder of 40,000 people breathing and shouting and living together, pressed against Henry's chest like a second heartbeat. He stood in the tunnel, boots laced, kit tight against his shoulders, and felt the familiar electricity crawl up his spine. But it was different now, cleaner. The anger that used to fuel him before a match, that sharp, burning need to prove and punish and dominate, had quieted. In its place was something steadier, something that had her fingerprints all over it. He looked up at the stands through the tunnel opening, found section 12, third row. There she was. Zoe sat with her hands twisted together in her lap, her glasses sliding down her nose the way they always did when she forgot to push them up. Even from this distance he could see the tension in her shoulders. She was terrified for him. She would never say it, but her body said everything her words wouldn't. He smiled. Marcus Cole walked past him in the tunnel, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The smirk said everything, the same smirk from the interviews, the same quiet arrogance that had wormed into Henry's head during the darkest weeks. Henry looked at him. Calm, steady. Then he walked onto the pitch. The match was brutal, fast and physical, with challenges that tested every repaired fiber in his knee. But Henry moved differently now, not with the reckless fury of a man trying to outrun his fear, but with the precise, deliberate power of someone who understood what his body could do because someone had taught him to listen to it. He won every header, read every pass, controlled the midfield like he was conducting an orchestra with his boots. When the final whistle blew, the stadium erupted. Henry stood at the center circle, chest heaving, sweat running into his eyes. His teammates rushed toward him, hands on his back, arms around his shoulders, voices shouting his name. He accepted it, briefly, then pulled away. He looked up at section 12. She was on her feet, hands over her mouth, glasses fogged. He pointed at her, then gestured down, "Come here." She shook her head, confused. The crowd around her was still cheering, still caught in the aftermath, and she stood frozen among them like someone who had just been called on stage without warning. Malcolm, seated beside her, smiled. He placed a gentle hand on her arm and nudged her toward the aisle. She made her way down the concrete steps on legs that didn't feel entirely solid. A steward opened the gate at the edge of the pitch, and then she was on the grass, the bright, impossible green of it under the floodlights, and Henry was walking toward her. The stadium began to notice. The cheering shifted, softened, became a murmur of curiosity. He reached her, took her hand, led her to the center of the pitch. Then he cracked his knuckles once, a sharp, nervous snap that made her almost laugh, and reached into the pocket of the jacket that Malcolm had left folded on the bench. A small box. He knelt. The stadium held its breath. "I don't want any victory you're not there to see," he said. His voice was rough, barely holding. "You're the only person I'd lose everything for and still feel like I won. And I want to spend the rest of my life being corrected, challenged and loved by you." Her hands flew to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks in fast, uneven streams. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder. "Yes, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that shook, stood, kissed her, right there, at the center of the pitch, under the floodlights, and the noise and the eyes of 40,000 strangers who were no longer strangers but witnesses. The stadium roared. Marcus Cole watched from the far side of the pitch, silent, still. And Malcolm in section 12 wiped his eyes with his sleeve and pretended very hard that he wasn't crying. Wildflowers. That was the first thing anyone noticed. The garden behind the old stone chapel in the Cotswolds was overflowing with them, lavender and foxglove and white daisies tangled together in the kind of beautiful disorder that looked accidental and wasn't. Zoe had chosen every stem herself, with the same meticulous care she brought to everything, and the result was a place that smelled like summer and felt like a promise. The ceremony was small. 30 people, family, and the few friends who had earned the right to be there. No press, no cameras, no stadium lights. Just wooden chairs on the grass, a stone arch wrapped in ivy, and a late afternoon sky the color of warm honey. Malcolm stood at the front, beside the arch, in a suit that was clearly new and clearly uncomfortable. He tugged at his collar every 30 seconds and scanned the small crowd with the quiet vigilance of a man who had spent his life making sure everything around Henry Parker went exactly right. When the music started, a single cello, simple and clear, everyone stood. Zoe appeared at the end of the grass aisle on her father's arm. She wore ivory. Her hair was loose with small wildflowers woven through it, and her glasses were gone, contact lenses, just for today, because she wanted to see everything without a frame between her and this moment. Henry saw her and stopped breathing. He had watched her walk into rooms 100 times, into his rehabilitation room, into his kitchen, into conference rooms and corridors, and the small office where she had changed his life. But this walk, slow and steady, with her eyes locked on his, and a smile that trembled at its edges, this was different from every other time. His vision blurred. He blinked, and a tear slid down his cheek before he could stop it. Then another. The man who had refused to cry on a stretcher in front of 40,000 people stood at a stone arch in a quiet garden and wept openly as the woman he loved walked toward him. Malcolm put a hand on his shoulder, said nothing. Didn't need to. They spoke their vows simply. No grand speeches, no rehearsed poetry. Henry's voice cracked twice, and he didn't try to hide it. Zoe's hands shook when she placed the ring on his finger, and she laughed at herself, a small, wet laugh that made everyone in the garden smile. When the officiant said the words, Henry kissed her with the same careful tenderness of their first kiss in that small office, as if asking permission, as if grateful, as if he still couldn't quite believe she had chosen him. Malcolm cried more than anyone. He denied it afterward, blaming allergies, the wind, the pollen from the wildflowers. No one believed him. No one tried. Their families embraced. His mother held Zoe's face in both hands and said something only the two of them could hear that made Zoe's eyes fill again. Her father shook Henry's hand and then pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than either of them expected. The evening dissolved into laughter and wine and dancing on the grass as the stars came out. 7 months later, Henry sat on the floor of the nursery, surrounded by wooden panels, screws of 3 different sizes, and an instruction manual that might as well have been written in another language. He cracked his knuckles, stared at the diagram, turned it upside down, turned it back. "You've been on that same step for 20 minutes, Zoe said from the doorway. He looked up. She was leaning against the frame, one hand resting on the round curve of her belly, her glasses perched on her nose, her hair in the same messy knot she'd worn the first day she walked into his life. "The diagram is wrong," he said. "The diagram is not wrong. Panel C doesn't fit into slot 7, it's physically impossible." She walked over, slowly, carefully, with the particular waddle that she hated and he found unbearably endearing, and lowered herself to the floor beside him. She picked up the manual, studied it for 4 seconds and rotated panel C 90 degrees. It clicked into place. He stared at it, then at her. "I had that." "You absolutely did not have that." He laughed, a real, full laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and surprised even him. She leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her, careful of her belly, and pressed his lips to her hair. They sat on the nursery floor together, finishing what he couldn't finish alone. The way it had always been. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.